So if you're into fighting games at all, you might have heard. Marvel vs. Capcom is back, baby. After the disaster that was Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite in 2017, many thought that Marvel vs. Capcom was dead as a franchise. Marvel and all the licensing that surrounded it was a huge pain to work with, and Capcom seemingly had little to no interest, at least publicly, in the franchise anymore, which was a disappointment to fighting game players everywhere. To those outside of the fighting game community, or FGC, Marvel vs. Capcom was a classic franchise for many. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 specifically was widely beloved by people in the community, hailed as one of the greats in the genre, and it's not hard to see why. Before we had the insane crossovers that were brought to you by the Super Smash Bros. Series, Marvel vs. Capcom was on the scene, bringing the insane roster of superheroes from Marvel Comics to clash against Capcom's classic IPs to bring together an iconic cast of characters that were guaranteed to have, maybe like a few characters you've heard of. But how did this sort of crossover happen? How did the franchise rise to success and then fail spectacularly? And how did we get to the position we're in today with the new Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Game Collection Arcade Classics coming out? Well, to answer these questions, we need to go back to where it all started. Arcades are booming. One of the larger names on the scene, Capcom, who had first risen to success with arcade hits like 1942, Commando, Ghosts and Goblins, as well as Mega Man for the NES, had just dropped a brand new hot fighting game on the arcade scene with Street Fighter II in 1991, igniting an absolute craze for fighting games with its massive success. Around the same time as well, comic books had seen a huge surge in popularity, especially in America, and specifically for Marvel, who had seen massive sales with issues of 1990's Spider-Man, and of course, the best-selling comic book of all time, 1991's X-Men, which sold over 8 million copies. Both companies were eating pretty good, and as both businesses were booming, these companies looked at the massive popularity of comic books in North America and the majority-owned markets of arcades in North America, and although the exact details are scarce, this would eventually lead to a licensing agreement that would see work on a new beat-em-up game, The Punisher, in 1993, featuring the Marvel character of the same name who had only grown in popularity. Upon its release, it was greeted with great reviews and even greater success, and this success, and most importantly the money, seemed to only further ignite interest from Capcom and Marvel at the time to further pursue partnerships and licensing agreements as Marvel looked to break into the Japanese market, eventually resulting in two new games the following year in late 1994, X-Men Mutant Apocalypse and X-Men Children of the Atom. X-Men Mutant Apocalypse would be the first Capcom game to feature the X-Men and would be released solely for the SNES. Although it was received well as a side-scroller beat-em-up, for the purposes of this video it's not nearly as relevant to the overall plot as Capcom's next X-Men game released only a month later, X-Men Children of the Atom. Children of the Atom lay the foundations for the Marvel vs. Capcom series going forward, being the first Capcom-developed fighting game to feature Marvel characters. The game would be hailed for its impressive graphics and 1v1 fighting mechanics that took ideas present from Capcom's previous games, Street Fighter II and Darkstalkers, to create some genuinely great gameplay. The release of this game coincided with the ever-popular X-Men animated series and the X-Men comics at this time in the early 90s, even featuring the return of some voice actors for characters from the animated show. On top of this game just being a great fighting game with X-Men characters, behind the scenes, the contract between Capcom and Marvel said the game had to include a Capcom character, meaning that although the roster was filled with X-Men, in the single-player mode of the game, Akuma existed as a secret boss, which could be seen as the first interaction between Marvel and Capcom original characters. With the success of X-Men Children of the Atom, Capcom had full intention of using Marvel's license to its full potential, releasing Marvel Superheroes in arcades not even a year after the release of Children of the Atom. Marvel Superheroes took many fundamental ideas from Children of the Atom, this time expanding the fighting game roster to include any and all Marvel characters, and I mean any. What is this exactly? Similar to X-Men Children of the Atom, the game would also feature a secret Capcom character, this time in the form of Anita from the Darkstalkers series. On top of boasting some slightly improved graphics, Marvel Superheroes added in a unique plot device from the Marvel Infinity Saga, the Infinity Stones, or gems is what they used to be called, I guess, which operated as 6 different power-ups with even unique interactions with certain characters, such as the Power Stone, which normally would just increase damage, but where Spider-Man created a copy of himself, or Captain America, who had Shadow Ninjutsu for some reason. The following year of 1996 would be a rough year for Marvel. The success Capcom was seeing with their Marvel games was immense, but unfortunately, this was not mirrored on the comic book side of things. Behind the scenes, Marvel Comics was not doing good. Although it's difficult to say when exactly it started specifically, the 90s comic book crash would be devastating for the Marvel company. The first sign something was off with the industry was with the 1993 release of Deathmate, which would have cascading effects across the industry due to its low sales and negative reception by readers. You see, at the time of the comic book boom in the 80s and early 90s, comic books were seen by many as collector's items and investments due to the Overstreet Price Guide, a guide to regional and national prices of comic books that, although did help people to resell their comics, also contributed to the inflation of prices of comic books in certain cases. This resulted in many comics being bought simply for the idea that a comic could massively increase in value over time, which, as we've seen time and time again, with modern equivalents like crypto, really only works when someone is willing to pay that speculative price, which was not helped by the amount of variant covers that flooded the comic book market at the time, leaving an overabundance in some cases of certain issues. 1996 would be seen as a defining year for the crash, as comic book giant Marvel would report giant losses, hundreds of employees would be fired, plans were desperately being made to save the company, with it all culminating in the end of the year with Marvel being forced to file for bankruptcy. In their process of trying to recover from this downward economic spiral, Marvel would be handing out licensing agreements like hotcakes, which is why things like, the X-Men and Fantastic Four film rights were sold to Fox, and most importantly, it played a role in Capcom being able to pull off something like Marvel Superheroes with its diverse roster of Marvel characters. This would result in a whole lot of Marvel games being made at the time, meaning this economic strategy would be the perfect storm for Capcom, and 1996 would see Capcom release 2 new Marvel titles. The first would be Marvel Superheroes and the War of the Gem, released this year as a side-scroller beat-em-up similar to X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, but far more important for this video would be the other Marvel game Capcom would release this year, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. This fighting game would be the first real crossover game of Marvel and Capcom characters, and could be considered the progenitor or even the first in the Marvel vs. Capcom series of games. The game would boast an impressive roster of 8 X-Men and 9 Street Fighters, reusing a lot of sprites from X-Men Children of the Atom and Street Fighter II Alpha, respectively. X-Men vs. Street Fighter would introduce a core aspect of the Marvel vs. Capcom series, the tag team system, allowing for a 2v2 gameplay style that we would see on a lot of the Versus crossover games after. In Japan, it was an immediate success, praised for its tag team system and fun, although heavily exploitable combos. In North America, it didn't see as immediate success, but over time became beloved by American fans, and due to the success in both countries, it received a home console port for both the Sega Saturn and Sony's PlayStation. Although the Saturn port was relatively well received, the PlayStation port was heavily criticized that it essentially was an entirely different game due to hardware limitations. The PlayStation port opted to instead just switch the game to a 1v1 fighting game, eliminating the tag team aspect entirely. Capcom recognized this error and how it could mislead consumers, so in Japan, the game's name was changed to X-Men vs. Street Fighter EX Edition, as to avoid any possible false expectation that it could be the same as the arcade version, while everywhere else, Capcom decided to just not do this, because, fuck the consumers, I guess. Despite this misstep, the formula seemed to be successful enough to warrant a follow-up game in 1997, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. Much like the transition from X-Men Children of the Atom to Marvel Superheroes, X-Men vs. Street Fighter to Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter essentially took the same ideas from the previous game, and instead of just X-Men, they added other Marvel superheroes as well. Crazy idea, I know. As is Capcom tradition, many of the sprites in the game were reused from the previous games. However, there were some new characters, such as the exclusive character from Japanese arcades, Noramaru, based on the Japanese comedian Noritake Kanashi, which has to be one of the weirder crossovers I think I've ever seen in a fighting game. What's next? That Norm Macdonald and Tekken? Dave Chappelle and Super Smash Bros. Although Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter didn't bring back the 2v2 tag team aspect, what set this game apart was the addition of a new mechanic, assists, something that would become a fundamental aspect of essentially any tag team fighting game going forward. One of the goals of the development of this game, as compared to the very similar X-Men vs. Street Fighter, was to tone down the insanity, as X-Men vs. Street Fighter is well known for having a good amount of infinites and other things that were considered a bit bonkers. Although on paper this would seem like an improvement, for many fans it was a downgrade, as they appreciated the crazy bullshit you could pull off in X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and for this reason, having creative freedom for combos became a fundamental design aspect of the Marvel vs. Capcom series going forward. Other than this though, the game was still relatively well received, but not as popular in arcades as compared to the previous X-Men vs. Street Fighter, largely because of some of the other monumental titles released in arcades this year, such as Tekken 3 or Capcom's own Street Fighter 3. As if this game didn't steal enough from its predecessors, the home port of Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter was also received positively for the Sega Saturn, while the PlayStation was yet again fucked up due to the system's RAM limitation, meaning that the game had to similarly remove the tag team aspect of the game altogether. And although some of the previous games could be viewed as included in the Marvel vs. Capcom series, 1998 would see the first official, at least in name, Marvel vs. Capcom game, Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes. MVC1, much like the previous crossover games, would feature a mixed roster of playable characters, finally breaking away from the only Street Fighter characters on the Capcom side. The most notable changes the game had was the dropping of Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter's assist tag system to instead keep the traditional 2v2 fighting style, but introducing a randomized third character that could only be used as an assist, meaning the game technically was a 3v3, but I'd say it still fell more into the 2v2 character category when it came to gameplay. After the criticism faced over the previous installment, Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Heroes would shift its design focus back to being absolutely crazy with its combos, allowing for a lot more creativity for players, especially with the addition of the third character assist slot. Upon its release, it would shoot close to the top of the most popular arcade games of the month, even surpassing Capcom's previously most popular game at the time, Street Fighter III. MVC1 would get a home release, and as you might have guessed, the PlayStation port would remove the tag team aspect to the approval of almost no one. Again. It seems Capcom had a winning formula on its hands, so it was no surprise that in December of 1999, Capcom would announce that they were working on a follow-up game, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. 1999 would actually be the first year in a while where Capcom would not release a Marvel fighting game, breaking the 5-year streak first started by X-Men Children of the Atom in 1994. But it seems this little extra time in the oven was definitely worth it, as in March of 2000, we would first get our hands on Marvel vs. Capcom 2, New Age of Heroes. If you thought the previous installments were impressive with their rosters, MVC2 would blow these games out of the water, boasting an impressive 56 characters on the roster, and not only that, but it would build off of the previous game's assist system by introducing an actual 3v3 tag team fighting game as opposed to the, weird third assist-only character thing they had going on with the first Marvel vs. Capcom. Upon release, the game would dominate arcades, hailed by critics for its snappy gameplay, incredibly large roster, and was praised by many as one of the best to ever do it, a sentiment still held by some to this day. At the time, some criticized the now iconic jazz soundtrack the game featured, feeling it did not fit with the franchise, which, I don't know what these guys were smoking, but time has not made these opinions age well, as this soundtrack is filled with back-to-back bangers, and for many, is a beloved part of the game. MVC2, much like some of the past Capcom arcade games, would receive a home release, and for once, we would get a PlayStation port that did not suck ass, thanks to the PS2 being released. Unfortunately, with the release of this landmark game, the licensing agreements that Capcom had with Marvel would end, and Marvel wasn't too keen on renewing it despite the success the games had. Around this time in the early 2000s, Marvel had some success in the cinema, with Fox's X-Men in 2000 and Sony's now iconic Spider-Man from 2002. Without being in as dire of a financial situation, Marvel stopped being nearly as generous with its licensing, deciding to instead partner with Activision for most of its Marvel game projects going forward so that they could have more control on the brand's image, meaning that it might seemingly be the end of the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise. And for years and years, it would stay this way. Retail copies of the games were no longer allowed to be sold, the digital market was growing, but still small at the time, so the only real way to play these games for years was through an arcade cabinet, or if you were lucky enough to have a physical copy of the home port of the game. But this will not stop fans from begging for a re-release, especially in the eyes of the competitive side of the FGC, becoming a staple in some of the most popular fighting game tournaments such as the Evolution Championship Series or EVO. And as EVO would become more and more popular, it only continued to draw more and more eyes to this iconic game that was now unfortunately so rare. In 2008, as many of you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe would first begin with the release of Iron Man, a film that at the time, most could not see the true impact it would have on the industry, causing cascading effects on cinematic experiences, resulting in a bit of a superhero renaissance. And after Iron Man's release, it wouldn't take long for Marvel films to start dominating theaters as they slowly built out the Infinity Saga. At this time, the digital market for games had started to grow in popularity, and Capcom, desperate to please their fans, was somehow able to manage to work out an agreement that allowed MVC2 to be released again, this time digitally, on July 29th, 2009, to the excitement of many fans. From here, it's believed that Capcom continued to work with Marvel behind the scenes, securing licenses, doing business guy stuff, that sort of thing. This would culminate in 2010 with the unveiling of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, with the first of 4 trailers featuring Ryu just kind of rolling around for like the first 30 seconds, as well as some fight scenes between beloved characters from both companies coded with a sort of cel-shaded art style meant to mimic a comic book art style, which would carry over into the game. And although fans were excited about the release of the game, behind the scenes, there was some tension between Marvel and Capcom themselves. Marvel had gone through a lot of change over the past decade, being acquired by Disney in late 2009, meaning that a relationship with Marvel also now came with the oppressive and bureaucratic oversight that Disney would come to be known for. And from what has been heard publicly, Marvel had become very controlling of how their characters were represented. One famous story I've heard referenced again and again deals with Marvel causing issues with Capcom over Doctor Strange's hand movements in the game. Maximilian Dood, who you more than likely know, also had a unique perspective on this relationship between Marvel and Capcom, as he directly worked with both companies during this time period, specifically for his Assist Me YouTube series that was sponsored by Capcom.
Outside of that, how do I know it was not an easy development? I literally worked with Marvel and Capcom. Literally had to go through the exact same process of licensing and approval, and Capcom foot the bill on insanely expensive licensing because they did not want us to use costume characters. They wanted us to use their own characters. It was weird. Marvel and Capcom always at each other's heads with the MVC series right around Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
Safe to say, Marvel was a pain in the ass to work with, and this was an even larger issue when it came to the roster, as Marvel was essentially able to veto certain characters from returning for this installment, such as, Venom and Juggernaut, and supposedly Deadpool and Sentinel were barely able to make it into the game and only made it in because of the people at Capcom desperately working to have them included. These issues aside, MVC 3 would be officially released on February 15th of 2011, with a roster of 36 characters plus 2 additional DLC characters in the form of Jill and Shumagorath. I don't know, how do you say it? Making the final roster 38 characters, which was 18 less than the previous installment. For some, this might have been viewed as a downgrade, and although some fans did have some issues with the game, for a lot of people, the gameplay and new stylized 3D graphics made for a worthy new entry in the series that fans were just happy to be able to experience. Although there originally had been a roadmap for further planned characters, as months passed on, rumors began to circulate about a new edition of the game being possibly released soon, and to the surprise of fans, not even a year after the main game's release, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 would release in November of 2011, adding in new modes, as well as the addition of 12 new characters, bringing the roster up to a total of 50 characters, which was pretty comparable to MVC 2. The only problem? Well, for anyone who had previously bought Marvel vs. Capcom 3, there was no way to upgrade to this new edition. You simply had to go out and buy the new game, which had retailed for $40, so fans felt pretty slighted with the purchase of the base game. They kind of felt like they wasted money. If only these naive consumers knew how bad the game industry would truly get. This controversy aside, UMVC 3 was pretty positively received, adding in fan favorites like Strider, Phoenix Wright, Virgil, Ghost Rider, and Iron Fist. Everybody loves Iron Fist. Much like past entries in the series, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 would obtain further fans over the years due to its relationship and presence at the fighting game tournament EVO, helping keep a strong and active community alive for the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise. But unfortunately, only a few years later, Marvel vs. Capcom fans would be hit with yet another tragedy. In late December of 2013, MVC 2 and both versions of MVC 3 would be removed from online stores, making them unable to be purchased. It seems that Capcom had yet again lost the MVC licensing rights, as Disney was looking to consolidate the Marvel brand, keeping all of their games in-house under their own development division, Disney Interactive. And with that one decision, MVC fans were yet again plunged into darkness as their favorite games were ripped from them once again. And for years, it stayed this way. Again. And if Marvel was successful back in 2010 when MVC 3 was first announced, words probably can't describe how successful these guys were, but money definitely can. Shit was everywhere. And after years of abandonment, Disney would fatefully make the call one day to brutally execute their in-house studio, Disney Interactive, which, although a tragedy, would spark conversation about hopes for the future between Marvel and Capcom yet again, allowing Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 to be re-released in 2016, this time to the current generation consoles, as well as bringing the game to PC for the first time ever. 2016 would also be the year where fans would get an announcement for a new game in the franchise, something people once thought was impossible: Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. At PSX in December of 2016, we were given our first glimpse at MVCI, with a short cinematic trailer to the excitement of fans who I think were just happy to get a new entry, but immediately there was some skepticism regarding the lack of certain Marvel characters like the X-Men or Fantastic Four. But this was just the first look, so there'd obviously be some more reveals for other characters later on. And with the release date of 2017 announced, that meant that in only 1 year, fans will be able to get their hands on the next entry in this beloved series. But as 2017 went by, fans would become quickly concerned for the release, as we got our next trailer in August of 2017, and it was bad. Although it was just a story trailer, the impression it left was not a good one for the community and for the excitement of the game. The pretty bad and cheesy story dialogue was not great, but if the game was good, who cares about the story? But the most notable thing was what assaulted our eyes. Some characters looked fine, while others... What is this? What is this, man? Who let this get through to production? Some fans were still quick to notice that with all the characters shown in the story trailer, there was not a single X-Men or Fantastic Four character anywhere in the trailer, which only further confirmed in some people's eyes that they wouldn't be making a return to this entry at all. But after this trailer was revealed, fans would get access to a story demo for the game, which was also not good, or at least only further showed off the flaws in the dialogue and the character models. The gameplay itself was relatively well received, but it was still somewhat divisive, as some were upset at the game going back to a 2v2 tag fighter unlike the last couple of entries, and despite these trepidations, fans would finally get their hands on the game around a month later, and yeah. The 2v2 aspect was initially unappealing, but the addition of the Infinity Stones added a fun aspect to the gameplay that players enjoyed. Outside of this, though, a lot of the other aspects of the game were just not great. The X-Men and Fantastic Four were finally confirmed to just not be in the game. Animations and models felt stiff and kind of just ugly sometimes. Critics weren't super harsh on the game, and although some fans found aspects of the game they enjoyed, it was safe to say that they were disappointed, which is usually not the feeling you want for your players to experience when playing your game. The game would go on to sell well under its estimated projection, and keep in mind, this was near the height of the MCU's popularity, which you would expect to cause a big increase in sales as compared to the previous games. And only a few days after the game's release, Capcom would announce DLC coming in the near future, which, why would you want to include that in the base game? There's no reason to do that. Especially since the game only had 30 playable characters on release. In about 5 months or so after its release, the final patch would be rolled out for the game, Capcom content to abandon the project to fend for itself. The next few years would be bleak. MVCI was viewed in many people's eyes as a massive failure. Over time, more and more came out surrounding the project, such as the abysmal budget, which resulted in 3D models from the previous game being reused, which had them just look off. A whole lot of character licensing restrictions, which is not that surprising. Just a lot of issues with Marvel, with not nearly enough support to succeed on Capcom's end, only proving more and more that the game was doomed from the start. And with this perspective and the reality that the game had lost money, most players were convinced that it was Jover. MVC, after being forgotten so many times, had finally met its end in a cruel and unjust way. Although most fans had lost hope, a few would rise to the occasion to support it, such as the previously mentioned Maximilian Doot, who on one fateful day would start a revolution. #free MVC2. In case you might have forgotten, although we were able to get a re-release of MVC3 in 2016, all of the previous Versus fighting games were still unavailable to purchase in any official manner, most notably of all, the fighting game titan that was Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Max would call to fans of the game, as well as to Capcom themselves, to re-release this classic game onto modern consoles, and the fans rallied behind him, causing the hashtag to trend on Twitter. People were going bananas over this shit, but after a while, things did die down, and as fans eagerly waited for news, Max had heard about some stuff behind the scenes, and they did not sound good. It seems that the power of friendship and community had unfortunately failed, and Marvel vs. Capcom had absolutely no chance of coming back. 0%. Almost impossible.
Ground farming. Take you for a ride. What the Clash in X-Men versus
on the Switch. What?
Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
The video game is playable for everybody. It's really awesome.
Marvel was back, baby! And on one hot summer day of this current year 2024, during a Nintendo Direct, we would be first shown Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Game Collection Arcade Classics, featuring all of the old games. And yes, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and yes, online games with rollback netcode and training mode. It was, satisfactory. And I suppose that brings us now to everything that has been revealed so far. And I suppose that brings us now, again, to everything that has been revealed so far. Big shout out to Capcom for making me have to re-record this ending. Honestly, I said we might be getting a Marvel vs. Capcom game in the future originally, but I'm pretty sure now it is almost confirmed that this is going to happen at some point. And for as long as the FGC and Marvel vs. Capcom community have suffered in purgatory, I think this is well deserved. So although this video is almost over, I think I can safely say that the Marvel vs. Capcom series is not. Thank you, everyone, for watching this month's video. Hearing this news about the recent collection made me pretty excited about playing these games again, at least without, like, an emulator, you know? And then I watched X-Men 97, and that just, like, really hyped me up for the future of Marvel again. I don't know. Special thanks as well to this month's patrons: Mads, Dave the Unknown, Griff, Einar Anderson, Turmeric, Maddie Grady, Zarl Dunking, Kenny, and Daddy Yam. You guys are amazing. I can't say it enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And of course, a big thank you to everyone else for watching. It truly does mean a lot, especially, all the support on the past video was very much appreciated. My bank account is very thankful. Anyways, I'm pretty tired, so I'm probably gonna go lie down. But until next time, take care.